Greetings, fellow detectives. Wizard Kitten here, bringing you a new Nancy Drew analysis video. Today's video is brought to you by the patrons over at Mystique Manor and by all the official fellow detective channel members. If you too would like to support the channel and gain access to exclusive features, check out patreon.com/wizardkitten to become a patron, or click join next to the subscribe button to become an official fellow detective. In the mystery genre, detectives often need to find a way to find clues, interrogate suspects, and explore crime scenes without making it obvious that they're doing so. Going clandestine gives an investigator the opportunity to put suspects at ease and move around a suspicious environment without raising alarm bells for the culprit. A good undercover operation should be entirely secret and plausible, such that the investigator is able to find everything they need and completely take the culprit by surprise at the ultimate reveal. If suspects start to get suspicious too quickly, the entire operation could be in jeopardy. So today, let's explore how effectively our favorite heroine, Nancy Drew, goes undercover. We'll examine how often she goes undercover, how she manages to be undercover, and how effectively she keeps up the ruse. Since we'll be touching on several plot details, there will be some plot spoilers and some information that could allude to culprit spoilers, so proceed with caution. But first, let's define what undercover means for Nancy in the Nancy Drew PC game series. To be considered an undercover operation, Nancy must enter the case with an undercover identity of some sort. This can involve using a fake name like she does in Warnings at Waverly Academy, but most of the time this simply involves an excuse to get Nancy at the scene and to have access to everything that she needs to solve the crime. And again, Nancy must enter the case in this fashion on purpose. If she happens to already be in a role that allows her to solve the mystery, but that wasn't her intention in the first place, then it's not really an undercover operation. It's just a helpful coincidence. A good example of this is in Secret of the Scarlet Hand, when Nancy works as an intern at Beach Hill Museum, and then a mystery occurs that she happens to be equipped to solve. But she's not undercover. Everyone knows she's a detective, even if that wasn't her original purpose. I want to begin first by exploring the only game where Nancy assumes a fake identity for the entire case, Warnings at Waverly Academy. In this game, Nancy poses as Becca Sawyer, an exchange student from France who is entering Waverly Academy mid-year. In the opening case file, Nancy explains that the secret identity is supposed to allow her to talk more freely with the other Waverly students without raising suspicion. The fake name is in case any of her social media savvy peers try to look her up online. To further avoid suspicion, Nancy isn't allowed to contact the headmistress of Waverly in any way, even though she was the one who hired Nancy for the case. In this instance, this is the most complete example of Nancy going undercover. She has to entirely pretend to be a regular student with no contact or assistance from anyone else. In theory, this is all a really good idea. It is absolutely correct that Nancy would be able to get more information out of the Waverly girls by pretending to be a fellow student, and it is absolutely plausible that they would try to look her up online. I would argue that this is Nancy's best attempt at being undercover, but in practice, she's not the best at keeping up the ruse. For one thing, she completely shuts down questions about her boyfriend, her previous school in France, why she has so little luggage, why she left her previous school, and so on. Essentially, Nancy forgot to invent a believable backstory, which rightfully makes some of the girls suspicious. Couple that with all the hyper-specific questions she asks and her sudden inability to speak or understand French, and we have a pretty laughable attempt at being undercover. Luckily, the Waverly rumor mill just attributes this to Becca Sawyer being kinda weird and probably having a sordid past that she just doesn't want to talk about. But this didn't happen because of Nancy's undercover detective skills. She just got lucky, and somehow manages to maintain the ruse until the end sequence. Even the culprit still seems to believe she really is Becca Sawyer by the end of the game. Nancy's other most successful undercover operation is in Phantom of Venice, which is also the only other game where she uses a fake name. At the start of the mystery, Nancy is undercover as a simple tourist, enjoying Venice and staying at Margarita's home on the insistence of Prudence Rutherford, who appears to be a patron of the case in a sense. Prudence must have a lot of resources and power to be able to convince the Italian GDIF to take on a random teenage detective, but she manages it. Perhaps she made a sizable donation. Anywho, Nancy stays at the Ca' Nascosta simply as Nancy Drew, but works undercover for the GDIF by picking up spy gear at secret locations, using secret communication devices, and generally just following orders. She makes herself pretty suspicious at times, like when she uses the binoculars to spy on Antonio Fango, and Margarita rightfully wonders what the heck she's doing. I also think it's pretty likely that Helena Berg, as a journalist, would sniff out who Nancy is pretty quickly. She's already suspicious at Nancy's complete and utter disinterest in cafes, so I think it's unlikely that Nancy would manage to maintain this ruse any longer than she does. However, her performance as Samantha Quick is actually pretty good. Partway through the mystery, Nancy discovers that a spy by the name of Samantha Quick is supposed to carry out a devious operation for Enrico Tazza, who clearly seems to be involved in something shady. To gain his trust and get information, Nancy has to disguise herself, successfully pretend to be Samantha Quick, and even has to carry out Samantha's secret mission independently, which involves stealing a precious sapphire from a heavily protected secret facility. Nancy does all of this pretty darn well, all things considered, and even manages to deflect Tazza's questions. The stakes are pretty high, and I'd say that Nancy as Samantha Quick is her most successful undercover operation. Nancy as Venetian tourist, she's fine. Samantha Quick, though, A+. In all of Nancy's other undercover cases, she pretty inexplicably doesn't use a fake name. As mentioned in Waverly, if anyone were to look her up online, it would be pretty disastrous for the case, and yet she manages to get away with it. There's one case, though, where the fake name isn't necessary, and that's Secrets Can Kill. This is Nancy's first mystery, and she goes undercover as a high school student at Paseo del Mar High School in Florida to solve the murder of Jake Rogers. Setting aside why she got hired to go undercover in the first place, since she doesn't exactly have a resume at this point, Nancy wouldn't necessarily need a secret identity here. Canonically, she hasn't solved any official cases yet, so her internet presence wouldn't be as incriminating. She also already has a plausible enough story of moving to Florida to live with her Aunt Eloise. She wouldn't even really have to explain why and could brush it off as something she'd rather not discuss. Overall, this undercover case works out pretty well for Nancy. The students all appear so wrapped up in their own drama and Jake's murder that they really don't care about Nancy arriving. It's also pretty normal for the new student to be curious about the murder since she just arrived and would naturally want to know the tea. Overall, not too shabby. The remaining undercover cases, though, well, there are some flaws. After Secrets Can Kill, Nancy's next chronological undercover case is as a fashion intern for Minette in Danger by Design. She doesn't use a fake name and was forcibly hired by Minette's boss, something that Minette is entirely displeased with. It makes sense that Minette wouldn't look Nancy up or dig further, though, because Minette is so self-absorbed that Nancy barely registers on her radar. Heather, though, is another story. Why did this random intern with absolutely no fashion experience and canonically no fashion sense get hired? And why do I now have to supervise and train her? It's possible that Heather could out Nancy. She never does, but I do wonder why alarm bells didn't raise. It's possible that Nancy just did a decent enough job of keeping busy doing chores that she did actually seem like a plausible intern, though she does kind of forget about Minette's House of Design halfway through the case, and no one seems particularly bothered. There are definitely some inconsistencies here, but again, Nancy must have just gotten lucky. But frankly, in White Wolf of Icicle Creek and Trail of the Twister, she gets even more lucky. Nancy goes undercover as the new cook and maid for the Icicle Creek Lodge. Nancy volunteers to be the maid, as it would give her an excuse to snoop around the rooms, but Chantal foists the additional cook duties on her too because she's cheap. While the maid duties make sense for snooping, they don't really make sense for interrogation. Honestly, I think it makes a degree of sense for Lou Talbot to be confused when Nancy keeps questioning him about his life. Normally, staff at a lodge, even one as small as Icicle Creek, would do their jobs and then skedaddle, but Nancy more or less asks everyone for their life stories. If she was undercover as a manager or maybe a concierge, that would give her more opportunity to chat with the lodgers. Heck, she could even masquerade as Chantal herself. It wouldn't have been suspicious for the owner to take over maid and cook duties for a time while she waits to hire someone new. And it would be perfectly normal for her to talk to guests and inquire about their experiences thus far at the lodge. What I think is particularly funny about this one, though, is that Nancy stands at the front desk and has several lengthy conversations with Chantal about the case. You know how likely it would be for one of the guests to walk by or overhear her nearby on the stairs? Very, very likely. In this instance, I would say Nancy is very fortunate she didn't get found out here. Same with Trail of the Twister, where Nancy works as a storm-chasing intern for the Canute Storm Team with no experience, no education in the field, and seemingly no reason to be there other than the guise that she is Krollmeister's niece. Honestly, Scott is kind of justified in his annoyance at Nancy's presence. I too would wonder why she's there. Nancy does a great job of making herself useful to the team, to the point that doing chores basically becomes the main plot of the game and solving the mystery ends up being a lucky happenstance, but ultimately, I'm surprised Nancy didn't get outed. Frosty and Debbie are on their computers all the time and never think to look up Nancy or her credentials. Nancy somehow never gets overheard when she's discussing case details with Krollmeister. All in all, fortune smiles upon our heroine once more. And finally, we get to the deadly device, where Nancy actually does get found out. Nancy initially goes undercover at the lab with the backstory that she is doing due diligence for a new owner. But this is really a terrible ruse, especially because Nancy doesn't use a fake identity. She literally goes undercover in a lab full of literal geniuses and expects to not be discovered. You're telling me that Gray wouldn't think to run a security check on her? You're telling me that Ellie wouldn't look up Nancy and the supposed company she works for on a whim? Mason maybe wouldn't since he's so wrapped up in his own world, but ultimately, it's Ryan who first puts together that Nancy isn't there to do due diligence. Thankfully, Ryan isn't the culprit and agrees to help Nancy, but this was a pretty dangerous situation to go into with a half-baked undercover ruse. Perhaps that's what the culprit intended, but Nancy should have known better. She's pretty experienced at this point and should have considered the dangers more fully. This video is more exploratory than some of my other more persuasive videos, but I think it's interesting to just examine a common theme within the series through Nancy's experience as the character. It feels like it humanizes Nancy for her to have some detective skills that she's really great at and others that she maybe needs to learn more about or practice more. In the area of going undercover, Nancy has some wins, but mostly plenty of things that she overlooks that could be detrimental. As an amateur detective, it makes sense that she would sometimes fail to consider something or flub her backstory or underestimate her fame. She's not a perfect detective, but that makes her more relatable. Undercover Nancy is not where she's at her best, it seems. But her daring, uncanny knack for puzzle solving, and ability to pick up dozens of skills at the drop of a hat often tend to make up for this weakness. All in all, an interesting thing to consider. But what do you think, fellow detectives? Is Nancy good at going undercover? What is your favorite undercover mystery? Do you like the undercover detective trope? Let a wizard kitten know in the comment section down below. If you really enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that like button or tipping me for the video with a super thanks next to the download button right beneath the video. If you would like to come join a fantastic group of fellow detectives at Mystique Manor as a patron for the channel, gain access to exclusive content, and support the making of more content like this, please check out patreon.com/wizardkitten. I also have channel memberships with exclusive badges and emojis to use during streams and in the comment section. If you'd like to support the channel by becoming an official fellow detective, click join next to the subscribe button. Please feel free to follow the channel on Instagram or Discord, linked in the description box down below. And as always, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more Nancy Drew and Cozy Game content. Thank you so much for watching, fellow detectives. I will see you soon.